Some names are not just names. They are legacies. They carry the weight of crowns, the memory of empires, and the echo of history. But what happens when the empire is gone? The crowns are dust, and all that remains is the crushing weight of the name itself. For Prince Karl of Leiningen, this was not a hypothetical question. It was the story of his life. His name is not one you will find leading armies or signing treaties. He is not Queen Victoria, his formidable great-grandmother who defined an age, nor Tsar Alexander II, his tragic great-grandfather. He was a quieter figure, an heir without an inheritance, a prince born into the twilight of royalty, tasked with navigating a world that no longer had a throne for him. His story is not one of grand battles or political intrigue. It is a quiet, devastating chronicle of a slow fade from existence. Born with a bloodline that connected him to the great thrones of Europe, he was destined for a life of unimaginable privilege. But that destiny led him not to a palace, but to a shabby, rented room in Israel, where he died alone in 1990. No ceremony, no mourners, just a body and a name that once held the power to shake the world. This is the story of a man erased by his own legacy. It is a journey into the heart of a profound mystery. How does a prince, born with everything, vanish with nothing? And what dark secrets must a royal family hold to allow one of its own to simply disappear? To understand the unique burdens that Prince Karl was born with, we have to step into the strange, melancholic world of European royalty in exile in the 1920s and 30s. The First World War had not just been a conflict, it had been an apocalypse for the old world order. The great, ancient, and seemingly eternal empires of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Russia had all collapsed, their emperors and kaisers swept away by defeat, revolution, and assassination. A new, more uncertain, and far more dangerous world had been born in their ashes. For the dozens of royal and aristocratic families who had lost their thrones and their fortunes overnight, it was a time of immense disorientation. They were now exiles, ghosts of a world that no longer existed, living in a state of diminished grandeur in the fashionable cities of Western Europe. Paris in particular became the unofficial capital of this lost world. Here in the cafes and modest apartments, a surreal new society took shape. Russian grand dukes who had once commanded vast armies and owned palaces filled with treasures could be seen driving taxis or working as waiters to make a living. Austrian archduchesses quietly sold off their family jewels piece by piece to pay the rent. They would gather in these cramped but elegant homes surrounded by the few precious heirlooms they had managed to save: a Fabergé egg, a signed portrait of a long-dead emperor, a piece of imperial porcelain. They would spend their evenings reminiscing, telling stories of the magnificent balls in the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, or the grand hunting parties in the forests of Prussia. It was a world of titles without kingdoms, of palaces without power, a world of grand memories and diminished futures, a world haunted by the ghosts of what had been lost. Prince Karl was a product of two of the greatest of these imperial cataclysms, and to understand the man, we must first unravel the two conflicting histories that were woven into his very blood. Prince Karl's tragedy was not born in a vacuum. It was the result of a collision of two vastly different yet equally profound legacies of loss he inherited from his parents. To understand the man, we must first dissect these two inheritances, starting with the quiet, dignified sorrow of his German father, a history that taught his family how to live as ghosts in their own land long before the great empires fell. Through his father, he was a prince of the House of Leiningen, a high-ranking German noble family whose roots stretched back to the Holy Roman Empire, a time when Germany was a patchwork of tiny sovereign states. For centuries, the princes of Leiningen were not merely aristocrats. They were ruling monarchs of their own small principality, masters of their own domain. Their world was irrevocably shattered during the Napoleonic Wars. In a sweeping political reorganization of Germany known as mediatization, their sovereign territory was absorbed into the larger Kingdom of Bavaria. In an instant, they lost the power to rule, to make laws, to command armies. Yet in a strange quirk of history, they kept everything else. They retained their vast estates, their immense wealth, their castles, and, crucially, their title and a royal status equal to that of reigning families. They became princes of a phantom kingdom, a powerful and respected family whose primary purpose had been erased by the stroke of a pen. This history instilled in the family a unique centuries-old understanding of living with dignity in the long shadow of lost power. Their connection to the great thrones of Europe was cemented in the 19th century through one of the most influential women of the era. The mother of Britain's Queen Victoria was born Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. Her first husband was the Prince of Leiningen, making her the Princess of Leiningen. After his death, the widowed princess married the Duke of Kent, and their only child would go on to rule the British Empire. This intimate family connection placed the House of Leiningen at the very heart of European royalty's vast network of blood relations, forever linking them to the most powerful throne in the world. The symbol of their enduring status was the magnificent Schloss Amerbach, a sprawling former Benedictine abbey in Bavaria that became the family seat. This was not merely a home, it was a private museum, a testament to centuries of accumulated wealth and culture. Its opulent Rococo interiors, its world-renowned library filled with priceless manuscripts, and its grand organ spoke of a stable, deeply rooted and powerful lineage. This was the world of order, beauty, and immense privilege into which Prince Karl was born. The fall of the German Empire in 1918 delivered the final quiet blow. With the establishment of the Weimar Republic, all special privileges for the nobility were abolished. Legally, their titles became nothing more than a part of their surname. They were still wealthy, still respected, but their political world had vanished completely. They were no longer pillars of an empire, but managers of estates, patrons of the arts, and hosts of elegant but politically meaningless social gatherings. They became living relics, ghosts in their own homeland, embodying a quiet, dignified melancholy. This was the first half of Karl's inheritance, a legacy of immense privilege and culture, but one shadowed by a profound and irreversible loss of purpose. But if the Leiningen legacy was a quiet stream of melancholy, the inheritance from his mother was a raging torrent of blood, grief, and violent trauma. She was Grand Duchess Maria Kirillovna of Russia, a member of the House of Romanov. The Romanov connection was the defining tragedy of his ancestry, a wound so profound it would shape the psychology of his family for generations. His mother's family had not just lost a throne, they had been annihilated. The brutal murder of Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Empress Alexandra, and their 5 children in the cellar of a house in Ekaterinburg in 1918 was a horror that sent a shockwave across the world and traumatized the entire Russian émigré community. The stories of the revolution, of the lost palaces, of relatives being shot in the street or drowned under the ice were not abstract history for young Karl. They were his family's bedtime stories. He was born into a legacy not of glory, but of grief, a grief that was profound, violent, and inescapable. The story of Karl's maternal grandparents is an epic of survival and controversy in itself. His grandfather, Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich, was a first cousin to the murdered Tsar Nicholas II. During the chaos of the Russian Revolution, he and his family made a dramatic escape, fleeing St. Petersburg and trekking across the frozen Gulf of Finland to safety, his pregnant wife trudging through the snow. His wife and Karl's grandmother was the formidable Grand Duchess Victoria Melita. To truly comprehend the ghosts that haunted Prince Karl, one must first understand the remarkable and tragic life of this woman, who was the source of so many of them. Known in the family as Ducky, her story is a microcosm of the glory, scandal, and catastrophic collapse of old royal Europe. She was by birth a princess of three great empires. Born in Malta, her father was a son of Britain's Queen Victoria, making her a British princess with a direct line to its formidable throne. Her mother was the only daughter of Tsar Alexander II of Russia, immersing her from birth in the opulent, almost mystical world of the Romanovs. Her life was a constant negotiation between the stiff formal court of her English grandmother and the lavish emotional world of her Russian relatives. This inheritance made her one of the most well-connected royals of her generation, a living embodiment of the intricate web of blood that bound the continent's rulers together. Her early life was defined by a battle between dynastic duty and personal passion. As a young woman, she was forced into a deeply unhappy marriage with her first cousin, Ernst Ludwig, the Grand Duke of Hesse in Germany. The union, arranged by their shared grandmother, Queen Victoria, was a disaster. The sister of Grand Duke Ernst was none other than Alex of Hesse, who had married Tsar Nicholas II to become Empress Alexandra of Russia. The Empress Alexandra despised Victoria Melita for the open unhappiness she brought her brother, creating a bitter personal animosity at the very heart of European royalty. The marriage finally collapsed in a scandalous divorce, an almost unheard-of event for a high-ranking royal at the time. The reason was that Victoria Melita was in love with another first cousin, the dashing Russian Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich. Their love was a passionate, forbidden affair that defied the conventions of their world. When they finally married in 1905, without the Tsar's permission, Nicholas II was so enraged that he stripped Kirill of all his titles and banished the couple from Russia. They had sacrificed everything, status, fortune, and family approval for love, a testament to Victoria Melita's formidable and unyielding will. Eventually pardoned, they returned to St. Petersburg and lived a life of incredible opulence. Victoria Melita presided over a magnificent palace, a center of art and society, her place at the pinnacle of the Russian court restored. This was the world she lost. When the revolution came, her idyllic life was shattered. Her flight from Russia was a harrowing ordeal of terror and loss. Pregnant with her son Vladimir, she, Kirill, and her young daughter Maria, Karl's future mother, trekked across the frozen Gulf of Finland on foot, escaping with little more than their lives and the jewels she had sewn into her clothes. The woman who had been born in a palace and hosted grand balls was now a penniless refugee, her family murdered and her homeland consumed by a fire she could never extinguish. This experience did not break her. It hardened her will into something unbreakable. In exile, Victoria Melita was not a passive victim. She was the ambitious driving force behind her husband's claim to the vacant throne. It was her iron will, the same will that had defied a czar for love, that now sought to rebuild a lost empire. In their modest homes in Germany and France, she meticulously recreated the rituals of the imperial court. She was the empress in exile, and she raised her children including Maria, in an intense atmosphere of loss and obligation. She did not just pass down the story of a lost paradise. She passed down a sacred, unshakable duty to reclaim it. This was the curriculum of Prince Karl's mother's childhood, and it was this profound inheritance, this blend of immense pride, violent trauma, and the impossible burden of restoring the past, that she would in turn pass down to her quiet, sensitive son. This violent, tragic legacy did not end with their escape. It would soon fester into a bitter conflict that would poison Prince Karl's childhood before he was even old enough to understand it. Having escaped the Bolshevik inferno, Grand Duke Kirill and Victoria Melita did not find peace in exile. Instead, they sought to rebuild their lost world, brick by imaginary brick. In their modest homes, first in Coburg, Germany, the ancestral home of so many of Europe's royal families, and the town where Prince Karl would be born, and later in France, they established a Romanov court in exile. They raised their children, including Karl's mother Maria, in a strange, intense, and backward-looking world. It was a world of strict Russian orthodoxy, of clinging to the old rituals and traditions of the imperial court, and of instilling in the next generation the unshakable belief that they were the future of a Russia that would one day be miraculously restored. This world was the incubator for Prince Karl's childhood. It was a world that attempted to preserve the glorious imperial past in the face of a grim present. But their attempt to resurrect an empire would not unite the grieving survivors. It would plunge them into a bitter civil war of their own, a war fought not with armies, but with manifestos, genealogies, and accusations of betrayal, a war that would form the toxic cradle of Prince Karl's childhood. The catalyst for this conflict was the most significant event of Karl's early life. In 1924, his grandfather, Grand Duke Kirill, believing that the last Tsar and his son were definitively dead, took a momentous and deeply controversial step. From his home in Saint-Brieuc, France, he formally issued a manifesto in which he declared himself emperor and autocrat of all the Russias, taking the title of Tsar Kirill I. For Kirill and his supporters, this was an act of sacred duty. As the most senior male line Romanov after the murdered Tsar Nicholas II and his brother, he believed it was his obligation to assume the headship of the imperial house and ensure the dynasty did not die out. He and his wife Victoria Melita established a formal court in exile. It was a surreal and poignant world of make-believe, but one they took with deadly seriousness. They issued imperial decrees, granted now meaningless aristocratic titles to loyal monarchists, and received delegations of supporters as if they were still in the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. This proclamation, however, instead of uniting the grieving Russian diaspora, ignited a bitter civil war. The declaration of Tsar Kirill I was not met with universal acceptance, but with a storm of condemnation, splitting the already fractured émigré community into two irreconcilable factions. The war for the phantom crown of Russia had begun, and at the heart of the opposition stood the most powerful and tragic figure in the entire Romanov clan, the Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna. Living in quiet exile in her native Denmark, the mother of the murdered Tsar Nicholas II was the undisputed matriarch of the family. She was a living symbol of the lost empire, and her grief was a sacred wound for the entire community. Maria Feodorovna steadfastly and heartbreakingly refused to accept that her sons and grandsons were truly dead. As no bodies had been recovered, she clung to the desperate hope that they had somehow survived and would one day reappear. For her, Kirill's proclamation was not an act of duty, but an act of profound disrespect, a premature and ambitious power grab that desecrated the memory of her lost children. She never publicly recognized Kirill's claim, and her silent, powerful opposition provided a rallying point for all those who viewed him as a usurper. Her stance was not just personal, it was a political decree that no monarchist could ignore. As long as the Tsar's mother was alive and in mourning, the throne was not truly vacant. The political and military opposition coalesced around another formidable figure, Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich. A first cousin once removed of the last Tsar, he had been the respected commander-in-chief of the Russian armies during the first year of World War I. A towering, imposing man, he commanded immense loyalty from the old military guard. While he never claimed the title of Tsar for himself, his supporters, the Nikolaevichi, saw him as the natural leader and potential regent for a future, properly restored monarchy. They viewed Kirill with suspicion, pointing to his ambiguous actions during the February Revolution as a sign of disloyalty to Nicholas II. This feud tore the heart out of the Russian community in Paris. The city's salons, cafes, and even its Russian Orthodox churches became political battlefields. Every social gathering was a test of allegiance. An invitation to a dinner party could signal which side you were on. Old friendships were shattered and families were divided by loyalty to Kirill or to the memory of Nicholas. Whispers of treason, arguments over the arcane Pauline laws of succession, and bitter accusations filled the air. The opposition to Kirill was not just emotional, it was legalistic. His enemies dredged up the arcane Pauline laws of succession, the strict rules that had governed the Russian throne. They argued that his marriage to a divorcee, his own first cousin, Victoria Melita, might have invalidated his claim to the throne. Others pointed to Kirill's own ambiguous actions during the early days of the February Revolution in 1917, where he had appeared with a red brassard on his uniform, an act his enemies now portrayed as treason against the Tsar. The Russian community in exile was torn apart by this furious feud over a phantom crown. You were either a Kirillovich, a legitimist who supported Kirill's claim, or a Nikolaevich, one who rejected him. This conflict dominated their social and political life for decades, turning old friends into enemies and creating deep rifts within families. This was not distant political intrigue for Prince Karl. It was the very atmosphere he was born into in 1928. He wasn't just born into a family that had lost a throne. He was born into the very epicenter of a toxic and all-consuming power struggle over a non-existent empire. His mother, Grand Duchess Maria, was now the Tsarevna, the eldest daughter of the self-proclaimed Tsar in exile. She was under immense pressure to uphold her father's claim and to raise her children, including Karl, as significant figures in a future restored Russia. Imagine the atmosphere in their home. It would have been a place of constant political intrigue, of whispered conversations about which distant cousin was a loyalist and which was a traitor. For a quiet, sensitive boy like Karl, this environment must have been incredibly confusing and stressful. The legacy he inherited was not just one of sorrow for what was lost, but one of bitter conflict and impossible expectation. It was an inheritance of ghosts, a world where the past was more real than the present, and where the hope for a glorious future was a constant and ultimately unbearable burden. Born into this war of ghosts, Prince Karl's childhood unfolded in a setting that encapsulated the contradictions of a Europe torn between faded grandeur and emerging horrors. Coburg, his birthplace in 1928, stood as a paradoxical enclave, a picturesque Bavarian town with cobblestone streets, half-timbered houses, and lush parks that evoke the romance of medieval fairy tales. Yet it was overshadowed by the relentless specters of political upheaval and moral decay. As the cradle of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, Coburg had long been intertwined with Europe's royal destinies, earning its nickname as the stud farm of Europe for supplying consorts and heirs to thrones across the continent. Prince Albert's marriage to Queen Victoria in 1840 exemplified this legacy, forging unbreakable ties between German nobility and British monarchy. However, by the interwar period, the town had transformed into a refuge for displaced aristocrats, a sanctuary where exiled royals clung to their titles amid the ruins of empires dismantled by World War I and revolutionary fervor. In this environment, young Prince Karl Vladimir Ernst Heinrich navigated a daily existence steeped in the rituals of obsolete sovereignty. His family, the Leiningens, maintained a household that preserved the trappings of court life. Formal dinners served on porcelain bearing imperial crests, lessons in etiquette emphasizing deference to hierarchy, and gatherings where conversations revolved around genealogical charts tracing lineages back to Charlemagne. The parks and palaces of Coburg became informal salons for this dispossessed elite. One might spot Tsar Ferdinand of Bulgaria, Karl's great-uncle, through matrimonial alliances, wandering the grounds in quiet exile after abdicating in 1918. Ferdinand's presence underscored the town's role as a microcosm of lost monarchies, where Bulgarian, Russian, and German exiles exchanged stories of Bolshevik executions, treaty betrayals, and the erosion of divine right. For a sensitive child like Karl, this atmosphere instilled a profound sense of isolation. He was surrounded by figures of immense historical weight, yet their powerlessness rendered them spectral, teaching him early on the futility of inherited expectations in a democratizing world. Compounding this melancholy was Coburg's darker undercurrent, its early and enthusiastic embrace of Nazism that cast a pall over the boy's formative years. As one of Germany's first strongholds for the National Socialist movement, the town elected a Nazi majority council in 1929, predating Hitler's national rise, and had bestowed honorary citizenship on him as early as 1922, signaling a willingness to align with radical ideologies. This development created a tense interplay between the old aristocracy and the ascendant fascist regime. The Nazis derided the nobility as effete cosmopolitans, their international marriages seen as diluting German purity, yet many nobles, including elements within Karl's extended family, viewed the party as a pragmatic shield against the greater threat of communism, which had already claimed the Romanov throne. Karl's grandmother, Grand Duchess Victoria Melita, was a first cousin to the murdered Tsar Nicholas II. This fear drove compromises. Aristocrats lent their prestige to Nazi events, hosted rallies in their estates, or joined organizations like the SS to safeguard estates and influence. For Karl, growing up in the 1930s meant witnessing this uneasy alliance firsthand. Swastika banners fluttered alongside ducal flags in Coburg squares, while Hitler Youth marches disrupted the quietude of royal promenades. His education, likely in private tutors or elite schools sympathetic to the regime, exposed him to propaganda that glorified Aryan supremacy while subtly undermining his family's multinational heritage. This duality fostered a deep-seated loneliness. As a prince without a realm, he grappled with the moral ambiguities of survival in a totalitarian state where loyalty to bloodlines clashed with the demands of the new order. These experiences shaped his reserved personality, embedding lessons in resilience amid compromise, and foreshadowing a life marked by introspection rather than public assertion. This moral ambiguity was made profoundly personal by the actions of his own grandmother, the formidable Grand Duchess Victoria Melita. As a victim of the Bolshevik Revolution, her hatred for communism was absolute. In the early 1920s, she and her husband Kirill, desperate for any ally who could help them reclaim their Russian throne, saw a potential weapon in the nascent Nazi Party. They met with figures in Hitler's circle, and through their own funds and connections, provided financial support to the early Nazi movement. It was a Faustian bargain, born of desperation. They believed they were funding a nationalist, anti-communist force that would help restore order and monarchy. However, the initial accommodation with the Nazis soon gave way to profound disillusionment within Prince Karl's family circle. The regime's crude, pseudo-pagan worldview, which glorified a distorted form of Germanic mysticism while promoting aggressive expansionism, directly conflicted with the Romanovs' staunch adherence to Russian Orthodox Christianity, a faith emphasizing humility, divine providence, and spiritual introspection. Moreover, the Nazis' rabid anti-Semitism, manifesting in policies like the Nuremberg Laws of 1935 and escalating to Kristallnacht in 1938, alienated the family's pan-European aristocratic ethos, which valued cosmopolitan alliances through intermarriages spanning Orthodox, Protestant, and Catholic realms. By Hitler's ascent to Chancellor in 1933, any tentative alliances had frayed. Aristocrats like the Leiningens recognized the threat to their traditional hierarchies, as the Nazis increasingly targeted decadent nobility for ideological purification. This reversal left young Karl burdened with an extraordinarily tangled legacy. He was an indirect casualty of Bolshevik terror, which had slaughtered his Romanov kin in 1918. Yet his own German relatives had contributed, albeit peripherally, to enabling the Nazi ascent through early endorsements and pragmatic collaborations. Growing up in this atmosphere, Karl inhaled a toxic blend of inherited grief from revolutionary atrocities, the crushing weight of royal pretensions in a Republican era, and an indelible ethical taint from historical choices he hadn't made but could never disown. His formative years embodied this inherent contradiction. Materially, he enjoyed the privileges of life at Schloss Amorbach, the Leiningen family's opulent Baroque residence in Bavaria, complete with vast libraries stocked with genealogical tomes, manicured gardens for leisurely pursuits, and staff attending to every need, a remnant of pre-war aristocratic splendor. Psychologically, however, his world was saturated with the Romanovs' exiled anguish. Bitter recountings of the Ekaterinburg massacre, where Tsar Nicholas II and his family were executed, permeated family discussions, turning history into a visceral ongoing trauma rather than abstract lore. For adolescent Karl, the 1917 revolution felt like a raw familial scar exacerbated by his mother's stories of survival and loss, fostering an early sense of existential disconnection. Adding layers to his complexity was his position as the second son, the archetypal spare in aristocratic succession protocols. In this stratified system, birth order dictated destinies with ironclad precision. The firstborn inherited titles, estates, and obligations, while siblings were relegated to supportive roles or alternative paths. Karl's elder brother, Emil Kirill, born in 1926, was groomed relentlessly as the future 8th Prince of Leiningen, his curriculum emphasizing land stewardship, financial acumen for managing the family's extensive properties, including forests, vineyards, and historical artifacts, and diplomatic skills for navigating post-war noble networks. This culminated in his 1950 marriage to Duchess Eilika of Oldenburg, a union that reinforced alliances among Germany's surviving princely houses, blending Oldenburg's Danish-Norwegian ties with Leiningen heritage for dynastic continuity. In contrast, Karl's horizons stretched into ambiguity, offering liberty from rigid duties, but plunging him into purposeless uncertainty. Unburdened by inheritance imperatives, he could explore personal interests, perhaps literature, history, or quiet reflection. But this void amplified feelings of superfluity in a lineage-obsessed clan. The brothers' bond, likely strained by these disparities, reflected divergent worlds. Emich embodied the pragmatic, grounded Leiningen domain, rooted in German soil and economic realities, while Karl gravitated toward his maternal Romanov mystique, a realm of poignant nostalgia and intangible loss. Not rivals, they coexisted as parallel narratives, with Karl lingering as a spectral appendage to the main lineage. Adulthood accentuated this split. Emich devoted himself to preserving the family's assets through meticulous administration and philanthropy. Karl, however, opted for escape, distancing himself from ancestral anchors. As a teenager during World War II, he observed the Third Reich's meteoric rise through propaganda-fueled conquests and catastrophic downfall in 1945, culminating in Allied bombings, occupation, and Germany's partition into East and West. This mirrored the earlier collapses he knew through family lore, leaving him upon maturity as a symbolic prince of triple vanishing realms, the defunct German Empire of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the annihilated Russian Empire of the Tsars, and the pre-1939 unified Germany shattered by defeat and division. In the post-war world of the 1950s, as Europe embarked on its arduous reconstruction following the devastation of World War II, the fragmented and displaced members of exiled royal families actively pursued avenues to reestablish connections and maintain their cultural continuity. These once powerful dynasties, now stripped of their thrones due to revolutions, abdications, and geopolitical shifts, found royal weddings to be an essential mechanism for reaffirming the persistence of their diminished aristocratic sphere. Such unions served not only as personal milestones, but also as symbolic assertions that their traditions, hierarchies, and social networks endured amidst the rise of republics and the division of the continent by the Iron Curtain. It was within this context of tentative revival and lingering exile that Prince Karl, having matured into a strikingly handsome and marriageable young man in his late 20s, yet characterized by a reserved demeanor and a pervasive melancholy stemming from his family's turbulent history, experienced a profound shift in his personal trajectory. In 1957, Prince Karl entered into matrimony with Princess Marie-Louise of Bulgaria, marking a significant alliance between two of Europe's most notable displaced royal lineages. Superficially, the event embodied the archetype of a fairy tale wedding, blending romance with regal splendor in a ceremony that united the Leiningen and Bulgarian royal houses. The venue, the magnificent Ammerbach Palace, a Baroque architectural gem in Bavaria that had long been the seat of the Leiningen family since the 19th century, provided an opulent setting with its expansive halls, ornate frescoes, and sprawling gardens, evoking echoes of pre-war European grandeur. The proceedings were orchestrated with meticulous attention to detail, incorporating elements of pomp such as elaborate floral arrangements, heirloom jewelry displays, and a procession of guests attired in formal regalia, all designed to preserve and showcase the ceremonial traditions that these exiled royals tenaciously held on to as emblems of their enduring identity. invitations extended to a wide array of European nobility in exile, transforming the occasion into a rare congregation that reinforced communal bonds among those who had lost their sovereignties. Beneath this veneer of glamour and celebration, however, the marriage represented a profound merging of two profoundly wounded historical legacies, each bearing the scars of totalitarian oppression and familial catastrophe. Princess Marie-Louise, born in 1933, was the offspring of the widely revered Tsar Boris III of Bulgaria, whose reign from 1918 to 1943 had been marked by skillful diplomacy amid the pressures of Axis alliances. His abrupt and enigmatic death in 1943 came immediately following a heated confrontation with Adolf Hitler at the Wolf's Lair headquarters, where the German leader allegedly erupted in fury over Bulgaria's hesitance to deport its Jewish population and fully engage in the Eastern Front campaigns. Officially attributed to a heart attack, the Tsar's demise fueled persistent speculations of poisoning, possibly orchestrated by Nazi agents or internal rivals. Given the suspicious circumstances, including his rapid deterioration after returning from the meeting and the absence of a thorough autopsy. Marie-Louise's personal history was one of relentless loss and upheaval. She had effectively forfeited her father to the machinations of the Nazi regime, her uncle Prince Kirill, who acted as regent for her brother Simeon II during the war's chaotic end, to a merciless communist firing squad in 1945, with his remains callously discarded in an unmarked grave as part of the post-war purges that dismantled the Bulgarian monarchy. Furthermore, she was deprived of her native land when the Iron Curtain descended, enforcing a Soviet-backed communist regime that abolished the throne in 1946 via a manipulated referendum. The parallels between her family's ordeal and that of the Romanovs were stark and brutal, both involving systematic executions, forced abdications, and the erasure of royal institutions under ideological extremism. Her childhood and adolescence were characterized by a sequence of bereavements that shattered familial stability, compelling the surviving royals into a peripatetic life of exile, initially seeking refuge in Egypt under the hospitality of King Farouk, then relocating to Spain and other European safe havens, where they navigated precarious existences, supported by dwindling assets and sympathetic networks. This marriage between Karl and Marie-Louise thus constituted a poignant intersection of vast historical traumas, where the Leiningen prince's Romanov heritage of Bolshevik-inflicted massacre converged with the Bulgarian princess's dual afflictions from Nazism and communism, creating a bond forged in mutual understanding of irreplaceable loss and displaced sovereignty. This marriage was more than a royal alliance. It was a profound intersection of inherited trauma. The ghosts of the Romanovs that haunted Karl found their reflection in the ghosts of the Bulgarian monarchy that haunted Marie-Louise. She was not an escape from his history. She was the embodiment of it. Theirs was a union forged in a shared, unspoken language of loss, a sad recognition in which two of the only people in the world who could truly understand the other's sorrow came together. For a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed they might build a future out of the wreckage of their combined pasts. Their joy seemed to be sealed with the birth of their two sons, Boris, named in a powerful act of remembrance for Marie-Louise's tragic father, and Herman. But the fairy tale did not last, as the initial harmony in Prince Karl and Princess Marie-Louise's marriage gradually eroded under mounting strains. The immense burden of their intertwined historical legacies, marked by the violent upheavals of revolutions, executions, and exiles, likely compounded everyday challenges, creating an unsustainable emotional landscape. This union, forged from shared understanding of profound loss, may have inadvertently amplified their individual griefs, turning mutual empathy into a cycle of reinforced melancholy. Alternatively, the mundane pressures of post-war life, such as financial management of exiled estates, social obligations within aristocratic circles, and the demands of raising a family in a rapidly modernizing Europe, could have exacerbated underlying tensions. In an era when psychological support for trauma was limited, especially among nobility who valued stoicism and discretion, unprocessed wounds from their pasts, Karl's Romanov heritage of Bolshevik massacres and Marie Louise's Bulgarian royal family's dual destruction by Nazis and communists probably hindered the development of resilient coping mechanisms. We can only speculate on the deeper dynamics, but the question arises, was it feasible for a conventional, contented existence to thrive atop such a bedrock of collective trauma? Historical precedents among exiled royals suggest that bonds rooted in adversity often falter when confronted with the need for forward momentum. Similar marriages in Greek, Yugoslav, or Romanian dynasties dissolved amid the weight of displacement and identity crises. When one's reality is perpetually overshadowed by ancestral specters, anniversaries of deaths, suppressed news from behind the Iron Curtain, or family relics evoking vanished empires, it becomes arduous to cultivate a serene, unencumbered present. The rituals of remembrance that initially united them might have evolved into barriers, preventing the couple from fully embracing contemporary joys or resolving conflicts without invoking historical parallels. Indeed, the core elements that drew them together, their laden, sorrowful backgrounds, could paradoxically have sabotaged prospects for a tranquil shared future as empathy devolved into codependency on pain, stifling growth, and intimacy. In 1968, following 11 years of marriage that had produced 2 sons and fleeting moments of stability, the couple formally divorced. This dissolution was conducted with utmost discretion through the German judicial system, avoiding media sensationalism and preserving a modicum of dignity in an age when public scrutiny of nobility was intensifying. Royal divorces during the 1960s remained uncommon, particularly among Protestant aristocratic families like the Leiningens, and they bore considerable social reproach, often viewed as breaches of dynastic duty and moral propriety influenced by lingering ecclesiastical norms. For Prince Karl, the separation transcended mere emotional anguish. It signified the disintegration of his singular, ambitious endeavor to construct a redemptive narrative from the ruins of his and Marie Louise's devastated heritages. Having already internalized the generational defeats, imperial collapses, familial executions, and exilic isolation, this intimate setback undoubtedly inflicted a crushing psychological impact, reinforcing his innate melancholy and sense of futility. The event heralded Karl's gradual withdrawal from societal engagements as he receded into the seclusion of the Leiningen estates, dedicating himself to private pursuits like historical archiving and quiet reflection, emblematic of a life increasingly defined by introspective isolation rather than public vitality. The collapse of his marriage was the final severance. The dream of building a new life on the ashes of the old had failed. For Prince Karl, a man already haunted by the ghosts of his ancestors, he was now haunted by the ghost of his own failed future. What followed was not a life of royal leisure, but a radical and desperate act of disappearance, an attempt to outrun history itself. After the divorce in 1968, Prince Karl made a decision that was, for a man of his standing, both radical and deeply revealing. He attempted to disappear. Prince Karl appeared to grasp that disentangling himself from the persistent shadows of his forebears required a radical departure from the continent that had shaped their legacies of loss and exile. This realization prompted his relocation to Canada in the years following his divorce, where he chose Toronto as his new base, a bustling metropolis emblematic of modernity, ethnic diversity, and a democratic ethos that paid little heed to hereditary nobility or the remnants of defunct monarchies. Toronto's skyline of skyscrapers, its immigrant neighborhoods, blending cultures from around the globe, and its focus on commerce and innovation stood in stark opposition to the cobblestoned, history-laden towns of Europe like Coburg or Amerbach, where every landmark evoked centuries of royal intrigue and downfall. In this North American setting, far removed from the Iron Curtain's divisions and the aristocratic salons of the Old World, Karl sought to reinvent himself, embarking on what would become the most incongruous phase of his existence, transitioning into the role of a conventional businessman. As the Prince of Leiningen and a direct descendant of the Romanov claimants to the Russian throne, Karl's immersion in the corporate sector represented a profound pivot from his aristocratic upbringing. He delved into the field of finance, securing a position at a brokerage firm where he engaged in the day-to-day routines of office life, arriving for a standard workday, poring over market analyses, evaluating investment opportunities, and interacting with clients from diverse backgrounds who likely remained oblivious to his illustrious pedigree. Hands that might have symbolically grasped a scepter or signed diplomatic accords were now dedicated to scrutinizing stock portfolios, forecasting economic trends, and negotiating financial deals in boardrooms filled with charts and ledgers. This shift was not merely occupational, but a calculated pursuit of obscurity, an intentional endeavor to strip away the princely mantle and emerge as simply Karl, an ordinary professional whose value derived from professional acumen rather than blood ties to vanished empires. Contemporary accounts from this era are notably sparse, underscoring his efficacy in evading public attention. No scandals, high-profile ventures, or media exposés disrupted his low-key existence. While he demonstrated competence in his role, navigating the volatile markets of the 1970s and 1980s with a measured approach informed by his educated background, he never ascended to the echelons of financial magnates like those dominating Wall Street. Instead, the endeavor prioritized self-discovery, offering a framework for deriving personal fulfillment and autonomy beyond the oppressive narrative of dynastic tragedy, where every family gathering or historical reference reinforced cycles of grief and irrelevance. Following his stint in Canada, Karl transitioned to Paris, a move that brought him geographically nearer to Europe's cultural heart, while still affording a degree of separation from the rigid protocols of his youth's royal courts. In the French capital, renowned for its blend of historical elegance and cosmopolitan vibrancy, he persisted in his financial career, perhaps leveraging international networks to handle investments or advisory roles that suited his multilingual skills and global perspective. Paris provided a sophisticated yet anonymous backdrop, its cafes and boulevards allowing him to blend into the intellectual elite without the burden of ceremonial duties. On the social front, Karl progressively disengaged from the opulent network of European royalty, eschewing the circuit of lavish events that defined his peers' lives. As cousins and distant relatives convened for nuptials in Madrid's palaces, baptisms in Stockholm's cathedrals, or extravagant soirees in Monaco's casinos, Karl consistently opted out, prioritizing solitude over spectacle. He cultivated a modest, intimate group of acquaintances, likely drawn from professional circles or like-minded expatriates, over the obligatory theatrical assemblies of exiled nobility, where conversations often revolved around reclaiming lost statuses or lamenting geopolitical shifts. In essence, he became a prince doubly exiled, not only from extinct thrones but also from the communal exile society that perpetuated those illusions. Acquaintances from this period portray him as consistently courteous, intellectually sharp, and poised with an innate dignity, yet invariably shadowed by a pervasive melancholy, a continuation of the introspective, tender disposition evident in his childhood, now deepened by accumulated disappointments. Karl's endeavor to relinquish his inherited identity was commendable in its ambition, representing a courageous bid for reinvention amid the privileges and pitfalls of nobility. Nevertheless, it ultimately proved unattainable in full measure. Geographic relocation could alter his surroundings, but it failed to erase the indelible imprints of history, the Romanov executions, Bulgarian royal purges, and his own marital dissolution that permeated his consciousness. Adopting the title of broker might redefine his daily routine, yet external perceptions and internal self-view inevitably reverted to his princely essence, with subtle reminders in correspondence, family obligations, or fleeting recognitions. Over nearly 2 decades of this self-imposed transformation, the underlying structure of generational sorrow persisted, unyielding to his efforts. He had physically distanced himself from Europe's haunted landscapes, but the intangible load of his past remained an inescapable companion, rendering his quest for inner tranquility ultimately unfulfilled. The controversy surrounding Prince Karl of Leiningen is a far quieter, more profound, and ultimately unanswerable one: the mystery of his final days and his lonely death. In the autumn of 1990, now in his early 60s, Prince Karl traveled to Israel. His reasons for the trip have never been fully explained. For a German prince with his specific background, this was a highly unusual choice. He settled at Vered Hagalil, a guest ranch and horse farm nestled in the beautiful rolling hills above the Sea of Galilee. The place itself is a crucial part of the mystery. Vered Hagalil was known for its peaceful, rustic, American-style dude ranch atmosphere. It was a place for tourists to ride horses, to hike, and to enjoy the serene landscape. It was, in every sense, a world away from the German palaces, the Russian émigré circles, and the high-finance world of Paris that had defined Karl's life. Here, he was not a prince or a Romanov descendant. He was just Karl, a quiet German guest. He kept to himself, living for some time in this state of chosen anonymity. It seems that at the end of his life, he had finally found a place where he could escape his name and his past, a place where nobody knew about the ghosts he carried. Then on the 13th of October, 1990, Prince Karl was discovered deceased in his room at the guest ranch by the attending staff, who had grown concerned after not seeing him for some time. The authorities officially ruled the cause of death as suicide based on the scene's evidence, including the method involving a firearm that aligned with self-inflicted wounds. However, the scene was overshadowed by a poignant and eerie omission. There was no suicide note left behind. Absent were any farewell words to his 2 sons, Boris and Herman, who were then young adults navigating their own lives, nor a concluding message to his brother Amick, with whom he shared a complex familial bond. This lack of any explanatory document, no scribbled thoughts on paper, no recorded sentiments, elevated what could have been a deeply personal sorrow into a lingering enigma that intrigued historians and royal watchers alike. The void of articulation turned his end into an unresolved puzzle, perpetuating endless speculation about his inner turmoil, unvoiced regrets, and the cumulative despair from a lifetime of inherited traumas and personal failures. This profound silence has since become a central element of his legacy, symbolizing the unspoken burdens of exiled nobility and leaving descendants and scholars with perpetual questions about his final mindset. So, why did he do it? In the absence of his own words, we are left only with sad speculation. Perhaps the most compelling explanation is not to be found in a single sudden crisis, but in the cumulative weight of his entire life. This theory suggests that his suicide was the final, tragic culmination of a lifelong battle with depression, a profound sorrow rooted in the inherited trauma of his own history, the Romanov tragedy, the Bulgarian tragedy, the failure of his own marriage, the constant feeling of being a man without a purpose or a true home. From this perspective, his final act was not an impulsive decision, but the final collapse under a weight that he had been carrying, silently and alone, for over 60 years. This brings us back to the final haunting question: why Israel? If his final act was the culmination of a European history of sorrow, why did he choose to end his life so far from that continent? We can never know for sure, but perhaps for a man whose life was so defined by the bloody history and tangled politics of Europe, the Holy Land represented a search for a different kind of peace. Perhaps it was a spiritual pilgrimage, a final desperate attempt to find a sense of solace or forgiveness that he could not find in the world of his ancestors. He had lived his life as a prince of fallen earthly kingdoms. Perhaps in the end, he was searching for a connection to a heavenly one. The quiet prince kept his final secrets to himself. His story is a powerful testament to the fact that even for those whose lives are documented in the Grand Almanach de Gotha of European royalty, the truest, most important stories are often the ones that are never told. His death is a powerful reminder of the unknowable nature of private pain and a tragic, enduring mystery, the mystery of the lost prince in the Holy Land.